And when you don't cut, it's like holding your breath psychologically. And we were worried that, you give somebody, I know they said a couple hours play a game without blinking, psychologically, are we going to create some serious player fatigue? But the hope was that it would elevate their emotional experience because we never psychologically remove them from the experience.
Hey, what's up, PlayStation Blockcasters? This is Aaron Kaufman. I'm the Senior Community Manager at Santa Monica Studio, and we are taking over the PlayStation Blockcast with a new limited miniseries called Worlds Collide. In this limited podcast series, we're bringing together different departments across our studio that collaborated together on a feature to evolve God of War. Now, if you watched our full-length documentary, Raising Kratos, you got a glimpse into our journey reinventing our franchise. On this episode of Worlds Collide, we're pointing the lens at a feature that has always been critical to how we want you to feel in a God of War game. But what happens when you unhinge that feature from tradition? That's the no-cut camera. From the very first frame in God of War when Kratos cuts that tree down, to the seemingly final frame with Atreus as they spread Faye's ashes atop the highest peak in all the Norse realms, the camera never cuts away between gameplay and story. We always keep you right there, seamlessly grounded on the journey with Kratos and Atreus. The no-cut camera, it was a miracle of collaboration across many departments, but really none more so than narrative design and programming. The way they merged technology with cinematography to establish a single shot from start to finish and every which way you could venture on your journey, it was unprecedented for God of War. And it was bold, it was new. We hope you enjoy the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Worlds Collide. I am joined here by three incredible developers of Santa Monica Studio who all worked on the last God of War game. Gentlemen, why don't we go around the horn? Let's start with Mr.
My name's Phil Wilkins. I'm a senior staff programmer on the gameplay team, and I've been working on the camera system for, I want to say 15 years.
Ever?
Probably more than that. Whenever we started God of War 1, so that's 2002, to now, 2019. So 17 years. 17 and a half years.
They should name the camera the Wilkins or something like that.
Well, I mean, if I'm going to, publish it and, the Wilkins standard video game camera.
There you go.
That's a life goal, isn't it?
True.
My name is Erol Oksuz. I'm a lead gameplay camera designer.
I'm Dori Arazi. I'm the Director of Photography and Cinematic Art Lead.
So Phil, I know we've talked about this in the hallways, but, 20 years, what has kept you here at Santa Monica so long, Phil? So long.
It's a good job. It's a good employer. Sony's a very good employer. I love the studio. I've enjoyed working on pretty much every project that I've worked on here, and I've got on canned the ones that I didn't enjoy working on. No, that's a terrible thing to say.
You're still here with us today, so we're
I'm
not
still
getting
here.
canned
I like making video games. I did a bunch of things before this that I didn't enjoy, and I found a job that I like. And you find a thing that you like, grab it and hold on to it because this world is hard.
I think everybody here is passionate and looking to stay grabbed on to everything we're doing here. Erol, I know you were with us a little bit right at the beginning of Ascension or prior to Ascension?
I came on a little bit after Ascension had started, yeah. So I was here through Ascension, shipped Ascension, did some work on it in 7, and then, the God of War, when that started up in 2014.
And, for you, having been here now about, 6 years, give or take?
Almost 9.
Almost 9, wow. My math is way off today.
Kind of 6, with a bit
time
more.
flies.
What has it been for you as we kind of reflect on the last 20 years?
I mean, for me, it's kind of, I feel sort of like privileged to have come in when I did, sort of kind of on the tail end of the classic games, because to be able to, work on that project after seeing it from the outside of the studio, from afar, how do they do that and all that kind of wonderful stuff, to be able to go in there, participate, and then be able to be on sort of a transition to evolve from what that was into what we did with the last game, I think has been kind of like, sort of like a once in a lifetime, once in a career sort of opportunity. So yeah, it's been great. And it's kind of nice to have this chance to talk about it and reflect on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dori, I know you've had a pretty storied career here just as well as Phil and Erol have. I mean, what's kept you here the last 5 years and change?
I'm the newbie considering these guys. I came in here just as the team was moving to the new building as we were starting on the last God of War. Yeah, been here 5 years. It's a great team, great studio to work in.
Awesome. So guys, this last God of War game, between Corey and everybody in this room, kind of all threw down the gauntlet together on the no-cut camera. It was the first time in God of War history that we'd kind of unhinged that camera and taken the player away from that third-person perspective. And, when people first heard about this, it was a polarizing idea, whether here in the studio, even outside to the fans. And I think now here we are over 2 years later, and there's no doubt in my mind and the millions that have played the game that we pulled it off. A miracle in its own right. And so, I'd love to just kind of kick off here and kind of like take people back a little bit and kind of remind us all. I mean, what kind of incepted this idea and how were each of you involved in that decision?
To jump in on that one, how the
Sure,
whole thing
yeah.
started. So first I heard of it was I had one of my interest interviews with Bruno, our animation director, and Corey, our game director. They kind of just threw it out there like maybe a thing they want to do. And I thought it was kind of, they were joking. But yeah, Corey has been wanting to do a no-cut camera for a while now. And, being the game director on this one, it was an incentive he could push. I was initially very skeptical as well, but as, Phil and Errol can attest this as well, when tech started to come in and we started to see that we can creatively pull it off, that was, pretty cool.
Yeah, I think Corey did a good job of kind of easing our fears a little bit by, in the beginning, it was like, no cut. But it was like, but, maybe we might need to at some point. Like maybe we can when we absolutely have to. And he sort of was like, yeah, if we absolutely have to. But we didn't have to. It was a big task from a lot of different groups, not just camera. It's, every group was touched by this. But I think that alone, sort of allows us to kind of squelch that fear a little bit and kind of go forward. And then,
the fake safety net.
It was a fake safety net. Because I remember, to me, one of the things when it was described was the E3 demo where the camera's pulling back and you're on the deer. I was like, well, how do we get from this close up? And then, like a wide shot with the deer and the vista. And early on, I was kind of thinking, well, maybe this is when we can cut. But we didn't need to, and sort of just kind of took it from there.
We just changed that scene.
We just changed the scene. Things were accommodated too, but
yes, absolutely.
What about you, Phil?
I was probably the only person who was like absolutely, utterly ready for this one. So we were having the first story time. This is the first time that Corey had. I don't think I was aware of the no cut thing at that point, but I was aware that we had gone to third person perspective over the shoulder. I'm pretty sure that that's where my head was at that point. So Corey gives out the first story time. We're going to do this and we're going to do that. We're going to do that, and we're going to do it all with no cuts. And you're going to do it, he says, pointing at me. And I'm like, oh, wow, okay, well. And the first thing through my head is, my bit's easy. The game is already continuously no cut. We blend between half a dozen cameras at any one point in time. Most of the work I'd done prior to this point was making sure that interpolating all of these cameras was going to be completely smooth. And, so for me, cuts are a pain in the ass because I have to, everything in the game suddenly has to sequence at exactly this point. All our multiple different stages all have to go together, or you get things not being where they are across those frames. And we have a few of those in the old games that I spent far too much time trying to remove. So I was already super focused on no cuts is easy. But at the same time, I knew that for everyone else, it was going to be a nightmare because for them, cuts are a way of avoiding having to do things. It's like, yeah, you can just cut here and now we can just put everyone wherever we want them. Everyone gets to move around now. And the player, because it's a cut, it's just discontinuity and they just don't see it. And now everyone else has to solve those continuity problems that I've been working on for so long. So
Thanks,
it's kind of like,
When this idea came about, who do you think it was going to be the initial biggest nightmare for?
Oh, whoever has to orchestrate all of the players, all of the actors in a scene getting into the right place. So this would mostly Dori,
where I'm raising my hand quietly,
because you have to have first of all you got to have you got to set the scene. You got to get. Everyone's going to be coming from various different places. Some of them are more scripted than others. One of them's the player, and you're never entirely sure where they're coming from. Yeah, no,
or where they're going. Yeah, it was pretty crazy. Making cinematics or visual storytelling in general, there's tools around that stuff. You have editing for continuity, you have editing for pacing. You can kind of cut between different types and styles of shot to tell a story, and all that just gets and it's gone. And now I have to figure out how do you tell a visual story without any of those traditional tools. So it was an interesting task.
So what was the moment like when you guys found this out? Was it for you, Phil, was during story time? Errol, Dori, where did you first hear Corey talk about this idea?
I can't remember if it was, I remember there was a point when Int 8 God of War was in its incubation, so it was Corey and a small team upstairs, and the rest of us were on Int 7. And they asked me to come up one day, and they just had some questions. And I can't remember if it might have been in one of those that they were asking about either keeping the camera really close, which turned out to be another one of sort of Corey's directives, an overall close camera, or no cuts. And it might have been in there. And as far as technically from the camera to not cut pure gameplay wise is like, well, we just don't put a blend time of 0. It'll go from one to the other. It's just making sure everything's aligned and all the other hard work that's going to really make it pay off. So from that respect, it was like, it's technically possible. But I think maybe because at that time, that project was still maybe a couple years off. it didn't frighten me that much. We had on Int 7, there was a certain point where a no-cut camera had been brought up. It wasn't as like a project directive, but it's something like, oh, nice to try. And those of us in the camera design team kind of fought to be able to keep our cuts because we utilized it for a lot of things. And the manner that we were making that game was less directed to facilitate a no-cut camera, which is one thing is like keeping the camera really close to the player character comparatively to where we're at with the old games. Having to have a no-cut camera when the camera is 15 meters back is quite a bit different when it's 2 meters forward. So I think some of those fundamental things for God of War made that a little less scary, but I don't think it really hit me at that time either.
Yeah, there's also the combat implication, right? The whole idea of the over-the-shoulder camera kind of on face value sounds pretty benign, but when you look at implication for navigation and for combat and for things that from the old God of War camera you're used to be able to see behind you just because of the camera perspective, and now suddenly you have this 180 degree of blind spot. And how do you account for that in combat? And how do you blend from combat to cinematic or from combat to navigation or vice versa? And that was a whole different ball of wax that I don't think we even realized until we started training those grounds.
Yeah. I think I remember early on, Corey had come by and they looked at some sort of like examples of like, this is how close the camera can be with the new character model or an early version of the new character model, et cetera. And it was really close. Like it was from his waist to the top of his head, and that was engulfing the whole screen. And he was like, "Oh yeah, check this in."
And then you're on the floor.
And that sparked, like I think like maybe a year or so of sort of active deflection from combat because they're like, sort of what the hell is this? You can't see anything. So for a long time, they were working with either their own cameras where they could pull it back to see what they're doing, which from a pragmatic reason makes sense. They would need to be able to see it. But slowly we went from that really, really close camera over like a year or so, it got pulled back further and further back. And I think Jason has talked about this in the past where, we went down this path of pulling the camera back to the point where the game just looked and felt like every other game. And then he sort of came in on this one weekend and pushed it back in. And with what had been learned in the previous year, put something together that could be like, hey, this is something we can try. It didn't make it easy and it wasn't solved, but like now we were able to get back in. So, and then, that set off another, basically until we shipped, combat working on the problem of, you can't see behind you. So a lot of things were done, for the enemies and for whatnot to help with off-screen indicators and off-screen attacks, how often they attack, things like that. So things we're still working on, it's an iterative process. Forever. So
yeah, there's a lot of teams that get impacted by this no-cut thing in many ways that we didn't even expect. It's stuff that takes a while to figure out, and then if one team solves it in one manner, then it might affect the way another team solves it for their problems. And at the end of the day, everything has to look cohesive. So there was a lot of literally pushing back and forth on how that camera's going to land.
So most third-party, most third-person, thank you, action adventure games kind of have that same issue, Batman, Tomb Raider, et cetera, where you can't see behind you. I don't think we've ever kind of dug into this as like one of the core fundamental issues of going to a no-cut camera in God of War. We always talked about there was a lot of dissent and fear and doubt, and we overcame it. What's kind of the difference in a God of War game with that problem versus other games that are kind of born with tackling that from their inception? Like, why was it a big issue for us initially?
Because we'd not done that before.
Yeah.
I would say. I mean, sure, we've got lots of examples to learn from. But yeah, primarily because we'd spent, so long making this game in a particular way. And I have to say getting away from that way and doing something completely different, bringing the focus in, bringing the camera under control was, something I've been wanting to do for a long time. Because it meant that for me that now I have a whole bunch of new problems to solve. And fortunately, I've got a whole bunch of existing games to reference, to take that off of. You can take like third-person camera games. There's two kind of fundamental styles with a player-controlled third-person camera. There's like a Resident Evil 4 or The Last of Us, and then there's the Tomb Raider or Uncharted style where you can go in any direction you want with the left stick, and you can run into the camera, and you can like run in directions and orient yourself and differently. So you can see what's behind you by fighting in a particular direction, and you have a lot more control. But with our style, it's a lot more tight and focused. It's more like a first-person shooter that you happen to be able to see the character in. So that presents, kind of a lot of difficulties and opportunities.
Phil actually brings up a really good point, because one of the main focuses of the camera style for the game was that we maintain emotional and physical cohesion from gameplay to the cinematics, to the non-controlled storytelling. And most of the third-person stories and games that we experienced so far have an obvious level of cohesion in the gameplay, but when it comes time for the cinematics, you cut and you have this whole different genre or language available to you to present your visual story. And we want to make sure that you don't have a different flavor in your mouth between gameplay and cinematics. So whatever we ended up landing on for the style and design for gameplay affected the language and style for the cinematics, and vice versa. So whatever we committed to had to account for a very broad game type language, which is very challenging.
Now, do you mean if I'm, even the first scene of the game where we go seamlessly from a cinematic to Kratos and Atreus fighting Draugrs for the first time, the violent and the brutality and the way the player has combat in that, and then coming back to a cinematic, is that kind of what you mean, like that visual language?
Totally, and having an emotional transition that's not jarring between those two events. You can be chopping some Draugrs around and then experiencing an emotional beat between Kratos and Atreus, and we can't cleanse your emotional palette by giving you a frame of black, right? It's got to flow through, feel right, pace it right, and the general way you look through the screen, right, the camera's essentially your eyeballs, has to feel the same way, or at least close to.
So maybe we could take a scene, maybe the first, the bridge fall, when Kratos and Atreus fall through the bridge, and there's all the frozen Draugrs around them, and they're having that scene, they're on the ground, they're asking each other, okay, and they get up, and all of a sudden the Draugrs come alive, and they're, boom, right back in it. Could you guys kind of walk everybody through the flow of each of your roles, how they kind of intertwine in between cinematic and gameplay and if you have a different scene that you'd like to reference, that's just one that comes to mind for me.
That's actually Serious Bastard. So I'd be happy to work on that one. I mean, it started with something that was a total pain in the ass for Errol. So
you gotta be more specific because that was a lot of
a lot of pain in the ass.
Yeah.
The one where you walk out and you still have control, but you don't.
So yeah, you lift up the there's like we call it debris lift, where you lift up this big pillar, you go under. That's kind of an opportunity to allow the player to engage, the scene. But then the game takes over and Kratos kind of walks out. He's looking around. During that time, the camera is kind of going wide, I think, to highlight the mountains, one of the goals. The player can, if they want, they can move the stick around a little bit. That was sort of, a little thing that Corey wanted to have in there and make sure that there's some agency. But then the focus shifts from that moment to, I think, Atreus navigates out on the bridge. Camera sort of zooms in on that, and then I believe the player pushes forward, and then there's something we call the time puppeteer, which would grab the player and navigate him to the proper point. That would then begin the transition into the cinematic. Mm-hmm. That little moment there probably utilized most of the tools that we had to transition out of these.
Yeah, to give a bit more information about what Errol just mentioned, it's one of the things we were fighting really hard against is not just to not hard cut between gameplay and cinematics, but also from an experiential standpoint on the player's stick, to not have them feel like suddenly control was taken away from them. So we played with a lot of techniques that we tried to give the player the illusion of control while we were transitioning them from a gameplay event to a cinematic event. And that was one of the techniques we tried on that scene.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone actually touched the stick or, you kind of just, once you see the character navigating away on its own, you sort of just put it down and wait for the next transition to happen.
Right.
That opportunity is there for them to do it. So that's sort of like, I think like player agency, and we're trying to be cognizant of how often we gank it away. So if we do something off of an interact, to me, that's a little less distracting than when you just kind of grab them out of nowhere. So sometimes we have to do that, but if we can avoid it, we try.
And then at that point, it was designing a relatively high action scene that culminates in a big, explosion action point. They hit the ground, debris falls all over them, so on and so forth. A moment of wonder, because then they get hit into this new arena they've never been in with these frozen creatures they never fully experienced before. And let the scene go in a controlled fashion that we know how it would end from a cinematic standpoint, but would seamlessly pick up into combat. That was also a pretty tricky exit because combat had to start and flow in a way that felt natural from that moment of wonder into a moment of, oh crap, where they're on top of us.
How do you guys, whether it's through programming design or direction, account for where the player is going to end up when you're going back into cinematic? And the camera has to whip in some sense or roller coaster to some area. Like the player can end up in a lot of different places.
A lot of this is possible because of the nature of the game. We generally know when a non-interactive like cinematic sequence is coming well in advance. So there'll be like triggers like a ways out that will start a process of handing off from the player control to the game's control. We're very, very aware of whether or not the player is touching the camera as well. So if they are touching the camera, then one set of thing happens. And if they aren't touching the camera, or if they've left it long enough that we consider the game is in control of the camera, it will do other things. But we're always trying to make sure that the transfer from gameplay control, the transfer from player intent into game intent, I'm going to get technical here, always has that second order of continuity, which is to say that the am I going to get this right? Is the acceleration feels like smooth and everything, basically everything's smooth coming in. We do a lot of, and there's a long chain, like technically there, because there's things like the camera is actually like almost parented to Kratos. So Kratos's control has to also take over really, really smoothly as well, because you see discontinuities in camera motion in the entire screen, like everything like kicks. So it's kind of like the worst possible thing to have discontinuities or noise in, unless you're deliberately putting them in there for effect, because we do that as well. But if you don't want it to be there, getting that out of there is kind of the hardest thing.
Yeah, the transitions were a pain. And to Phil's point, when the camera's wrong, your eyeballs are wrong. When your eyeballs are wrong, just your experience of everything is just wrong. So, and on the cinematic side, we called it the buttery smoothness pass, is how do we get this thing to just glide right in? We had a list of different types of mechanics that we could preempt and help glide kind of the character into where they needed to be. And we just had to make sure to communicate that to the environment and the level design, so we can get them to pick up from where we intend to lay off, and vice versa. From the exit, our hope was that you watch a scene that hopefully everybody thinks is beautiful, and then suddenly the players is not moving, like, what's going on? Oh, I'm in control. And we wanted that element of like, wow, I had no idea this was happening.
Was there any cinematic to gameplay moment that you guys were like, no way in hell, that's not going to work?
Dragon?
Oh.
Oh, no,
yeah, I mean, there was, there were some sequences that, I went through different pipelines. We had a cinematic pipeline and we had a gameplay pipeline. And some of them proved to be more challenging than others, just because we weren't sure what we were making for most good part of the project. Like boss fights were one where the boss fight itself is evolving up to the end of the project. So there's these planned moments, but sometimes you kind of work with a lot of unknowns. So I think the dragon fight, the transitions in some of those had a lot more variables than we'd have in a cinematic transition. I think a lot of the cine transitions, Dori would work with level design. They talk about where it's going in, where it's going to happen. They can ensure there's lots of funnels. With some of the boss transitions, it can kind of happen anywhere in arena. So I think the dragon one was particularly challenging because it was initially designed where you would be up against the dragon and you would attack the dragon and you could blend in from there. But you could also trigger this from being 10 meters back and throwing your axe and hitting that health threshold. So there are some things we had to do where the kind of camera has to lift up, focus on the dragon, Kratos under the hood is moved, then we can blend into the scene. Those were all learning experiences because we didn't know what kind of things we were going to get ourselves into. Now we have, and we're trying to keep that in mind going forward.
Definitely a lot of good growing pains.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one of the annoying challenges that we have to run into a lot, which is it's kind of fun when we solve it well, is coming out of combat into a cinematic. Because like Erol was saying, if it's a boss fight, it could be anywhere. If it's fighting a group of whatever, it can be anywhere. And most of the cinematics happen in a defined position just to maintain background. So getting you to where you need to be, where you might actually be on the other side of the arena without noticing we put you 30 feet to the left, could be challenging.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's like a subconscious movement that you don't realize we're doing. It's like it's a magic trick, really.
It's sleight of hand, essentially.
Yeah. So like there's one in particular that's my favorite that Dori and them worked on.
First Human Kill.
First Human Kill.
Yeah.
So it's you come into this room and you fight these humans, and after cinematic they transform. Actually, no, it's before that. When you fight them as humans, when you kill the last guy, Kratos kind of gets jumped by somebody in the camera, and then they tussle around. I'll let Dori go into the details, but to me, that was something that could happen anywhere in that room, even though they also hedged their bets and also placed the last enemy strategically. So you'd be in sort of the best position to initiate the sequence. But what they did when that sequence happened, we were able to sort of test the debug, and you can be any four corners of this large room, and you would get put into a very particular place, and you couldn't tell. It was, to me, the best transition in the game. I don't know if you want to go into that.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think it was one of our better successes, and we learned a lot from that one. What we essentially did is find a good way for Kratos to initiate a very jarring move that creates a lot of movement in the background but keeps him relatively centered on frame, and utilize essentially a lot of motion blur in the background to jump that motion blur into another frame of motion blur that could be on the other side of the arena. So it's completely not noticeable. And we found that if we control the background luminance, or just the way the environment is lit, as long as we don't jump the luminance, we can teleport you a mile and you won't notice. So yeah, that worked pretty well.
So Phil, when you're hearing this scene at the beginning of its inception, is this setting programming's hair on fire to figure out how to make happen? Or do these guys already have the tools to make it happen?
I was not aware that that scene was that complicated. I like to think that I gave them the tools to be able to solve that one relatively early. But
that one, I think that, I mean, there
are definitely scenes that I remember being problematic, though. There's one section that I think for the first time I was watching it from the first time it came into our group, probably about halfway through the project, to almost the day we were done with the project. And that's the Kratos throwing a boulder in the first fight.
Oh, yeah.
Because that similarly you can get him down to that level of health almost anywhere in that arena.
Yeah.
And you're sending him to a very specific spot.
Yeah.
And the number of iterations on that, I mean, it was so many times I saw you working on that, and I fixed so many little bugs for it, so much the whole chain.
My part of that was just kind of just moving these numbers around just to finagle things. I think that was Fabian and Danny worked on that, and like it was there. The transition worked. Like you could get grabbed by Baldur and you get thrown, you get there. But during some of those cuts, the mechanism that we were using to move the player across the level could be kind of finicky when you're jumping through various moves under the hood. There's a lot of time at the end spent just kind of like getting numbers just right, and asking Fabian, hey, can you move this joint just a little bit here just to get it all lined up. I mean, it was worth it in the end, but yeah, there's lessons from that we've taken to like let's maybe keep things as like one move rather than cutting it up, just so we can mitigate how many problems we could have. But that one and the first human kill transition was one where the gameplay team did a lot of work to actually be able to move the player from that spot where it could happen anywhere into a very very particular spot at a certain point in the cinematic or the sync move. So it's just an example of like the camera portion of it. We're setting how quickly the camera blends, looking at sort of, where joints might be because we're most familiar with them. But a lot of the work falls on authoring on the animation side, engineering on the gameplay side, and then any in the combat side as well, like making sure that transition to narrative, works as seamlessly as it did.
Yeah, to Erol's point, we actually stole some of the tech from combat for that scenario. Tech they used to get the characters in sync for a synchronized movement in combat.
So when you say joints, you're talking about legs, limbs, arms,
knees, elbows,
fingers, where they are on screen.
For us, mostly it's one very particular joint.
The fibia, the knee.
We have there's like a logical joint called the zero joint or the camera joint. We have two of those. Those are ones that we're mostly concerned about because a lot of the animated cameras will get baked out relative to that. The rest of the joints we leave to the animators we don't touch anything.
To hurt ourselves.
Yes.
We're, going back to, again, because I don't think we really dug into this in our marketing campaign or even after in Raising Kratos per se, but again, Corey expressed a lot of, there was doubt, right? This seemed like a miracle. Didn't think we could pull this off, but, you guys all came together. And what I'm hearing is a lot of it came down to that core issue of couldn't see behind the player can't see behind them, that kind of that 180 perspective. And maybe that's not the only core issue, but like for you guys, what were some of the core issues that, that you guys had to get over? And when was that point when everybody was like, it's working? This is it. We've got it.
I think when we released.
That is a very good point.
No.
Or some of the key valleys that you guys had to get through.
Yeah, I mean the E3 2016 demo was do or die for a lot of it. So anything that was janky or unrefined or whatever had to get addressed. So that moved so much forward.
Yeah, that was a big one. Watching that thing flow, and it was playable. I'm sure that there were some rails that if you fell off of, things might look a little janky. But it, at least from an experiential standpoint, it was 10 minutes of a thing that had controlled and non-controlled storytelling, combat and exploration, and it flowed. It flowed well. Erol was mentioning that big Vista shot at the end where you reveal the dragon. By that point, you're like, we can probably pull this off.
I think watching the reaction videos that came out of that were kind of like crack cocaine to us for the next couple of years because, I mean,
To this day.
to this day, even when we're feeling down, I'll load one of those up because it was, we were doing a lot of stuff and we just didn't know how it was going to get received.
Yeah.
But I mean, even so, the E3 2016 was based on, I think you guys have shown earlier, like earlier demos based on that kind of similar story. Kratos and the sun go out. And I remember, I think that first version of that was finished like end of 2015, and I was just sitting in the boardroom in one of the reviews towards the end, and the lights were off, and we're watching it. And even when that ended, and in the state that it was in, I felt something at the end of that, like just that as an experience. I wasn't looking at any of the pieces of it, just kind of taking the whole thing in. And then I felt that same thing when we were doing reviews for the E3, even though like early on it was kind of putting it together, taking things out, moving it around. There's a certain point where you're in one of the reviews, the lights are off, you watch it, and you feel something that you've worked on, you've contributed to. So even though you're close to it, it can still affect you. I think that came through in the reveal as well. Because when we watch people watching that, they're mostly engaged, they're mostly silent throughout, and I think that's kind of a testament to the power of the story, to what the combat was showed, and the ability to kind of keep them engaged throughout without having to cut. Like, I think it doesn't really give you a chance to reset, but in a good way, because they manage sort of the intensity of it, the pacing of it.
Yeah. One of the main things that we're concerned about is that cutting is a psychological blink. It helps you kind of cleanse your mental palate, and it helps your mind cognitively rest a little, even if it's like a microsecond. And you cut a lot, you blink a lot, and you can take in a lot of story, and it gives you a lot of stamina for a lot of story. And when you don't cut, it's like holding your breath psychologically. And we were worried that, you give somebody, I know they said a couple hours, play a game without blinking psychologically, are we going to create some serious player fatigue? But the hope was that it would elevate their emotional experience because we never psychologically remove them from the experience. And like Erol was saying, I remember one of those reviews, everybody's sitting in a dark room and you see a thing that you've been working on. It's a creative review. And you used to lights coming up and everybody just immediately started to talk about the things we need or not need to do. And towards the end of the iterations, the trailer was done, the E3 trailer was done, and there was just silence in the room. And they're like, okay, people didn't blink for the last 10 minutes and they feel good about it. It resonated. And that was like, dinging the bell right there.
We still had no idea how it was going to be received. So
Totally.
That was
We liked it though.
Yeah.
It's been mentioned a little bit that part of our no-cut camera has enabled our kind of seamless load times as well, kind of load in the universe. I mean, how does that, as Phil looks on and like, oh my God.
That was about to happen.
I mean, it's no secret that the PS4 is not a seamless loading machine, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have to have a load time. How big of a challenge was that? And it was like the no-cut camera was like a gift and a curse at the same time, maybe?
I as far as seamless gameplay goes, I recommend that everyone go back and play the very first God of War, because that is a seamless experience from beginning to end. There's no loading in that game. And that was hard. That was like coming directly off of optical with no hard drive in between. And then we did the same thing for 3 by taking advantage of the hard drive in between and having an active cache that knew what was coming up and pre-warmed it, so everything arrived in the right time, so it was massively efficient off of it. To this one where, nice big hard drive, we know everything's coming. This is easy compared to some of the earlier stuff, but you do have to do it from the beginning because you have to know like in advance where everything's coming from, and you've got one of those games like ours, which is largely a long piece of string, or like it is now, which is kind of like a star with lots of bits of string coming off of it. It's very easy to predict where you're going unless you're right in the middle where everything comes off of, and those rooms, those hubs tend to be nightmares, but at the same time, you still know things. So yeah, there's a lot of magic in there, and there's a lot of stuff that I am very proud of for this studio to have achieved over these years. If we hadn't done it for that last game, that would have been a shock from my perspective. So we've been working on that aspect for a long time.
It's good to remind people, God of War historically has kind of had that no-cut camera in quotation marks, right? Mm-hmm. I think it's, we talk about it in a way that this is the first time, but, we've done it in ways that were technically magical in the past games. And I think it's important to remind that, especially as we reflect on 20 years.
We're not the first either. I mean, we cribbed heavily off of other games that also worked in a similar way. I mean, the no loading thing is directly taken from Naughty Dog. You have to be inspired by, the way that they streamed these enormous levels for Crash, because, again, they're pieces of string, so they knew exactly where they were going. But they produced an amazing visual quality at that same time. And Jack and Daxter, very early PS2 game that we were like, these guys are setting a technical bar, so, we have to reach for that bar. And, in some respects, maybe we've... Oh, no, I can't say that. They're a perpetual inspiration to us.
Yeah. I mean, also a lot of kudos should go to the, our team and the capability of the new machines and what they could render, and obviously with what they can render from the art team. Because there's always been like that liar syndrome in games. Cinematics are looking all nice and awesome, and then you play the game and it's a thing jumping up a platform. But we were actually able to create a cinematic experience that blends into the game that looks exactly like the cinematic experience, and then back into a cinematic that looks exactly like the game. So sure, we didn't cut the camera, but also visually we could maintain that level of cohesion across the entire experience.
I think, one part of it is just like their ability to handle the anti-aliasing. Like
Right.
we used to, in the earlier God of War games, we tried putting a little bit of handheld sway on the camera, and if you stood still, the entire background would just shimmer, so we had to knew how to take it off. But in this game, there's none of that, so we were able to kind of maintain some of that language from the cinematic into gameplay without having to, worry about that kind of the problem that we'd had historically.
We crossed a threshold where continuously moving the camera actually helps the rendering engineers. In fact, at a very low level, even if we stop moving the camera is actually perpetually moving by by a subpixel just to keep the temporal stuff happy. I may not be 100% on this. I'm not a rendering engineer, but my understanding is that now they just want continuous noise, because small amounts of noise fixes a lot of things.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I know, I don't think there is a moment in the entire game that does not have any level of some form of handheld.
Unless it's turned off.
Unless it's turned off, right?
Yeah.
Unless it's explicitly turned off by the player. But it is true.
How did you guys bring that kind of documentary filmmaking style to the game, between narrative and the gameplay? What were some of the hooks from programming design and
Right.
direction that brought that in?
I mean, first it was to try to figure out what style of documentary we want to do, right? Because there's many different style of documentary, but the bottom line of documentary is you want to tell a story that is about a real thing that took place, but here's how, and let me bring you into that story. We thought it would be incredibly fun to create that kind of approach to something that is essentially fantasy, like real high fantasy. So it's like, hey, this real fantasy actually took place, and let's take you into that journey. Handheld was definitely part of it. It has kind of that raw, there's really somebody there behind there on the camera doing a thing, and they're really
You were
in
there.
there. I was there. I really was. I have the scars to show. So the handheld library was, for me at least, a very big deal, a very big part of it. I remember days where Erol and I were in mocap stage, and I was tethered to a treadmill, running with a camera in my hand to mocap how a running camera would look.
But you were on a moving treadmill.
The treadmill was static, but I was running on that treadmill.
Okay, it was static.
Yeah.
Why wasn't it running?
Because, it was
That's
running,
not fun.
but I was running.
Treadmill
The
is
treadmill was not.
moving, the belt on the treadmill is moving, and the airplane takes off if it has enough thrust. Okay,
There
can we
you go.
move
There
on?
you go. Like that.
Yes.
Or trying to figure out what to do with a boat, and we created this seesaw on the mocap stage and to create the right kind of buoyancy. So it was really about trying to make sure that whatever we put on the screen was something that was very authentic and felt real. And so every time we kind of tethered or layered that on top of a visual experience, it helped ground it more into the this is really happening place, and not just like, hey, look at this cool stuff.
And how does, I know we talked about this a little early on, but maybe we could just go just a little bit deeper on when a scene has been concepted and you've shot it on the mocap stage. Between the three of you, programming, design, and camera direction, what are the dependencies that you guys all have to rely on each other for, when you're filming that scene?
Right. So, I mean, for me at least, it starts with a lot of communications with Phil and Erol, because I need to know what I'm allowed to do and what I'm explicitly not allowed to do. So sometimes you have these crazy ideas about, hey, look at the script, we can do this or that. And, you talk to the guys and they're like, it's probably not the greatest idea. So, they're the grounding anchor of what is possible.
We're the killjoys.
You're the killjoys. Yeah. I was
Both
trying
of
to
you
be nice, but
combined.
yes. Killjoy Incorporated. But yeah, I mean, most of the tools they give us are pretty epic. So it's very rare that we want to do a thing that we can't. Yeah, but I mean, I'm sure they can talk a little deeper about the intricacies. Errol's got the hands on how, and Phil's got the fingers on making it happen.
I think for most of the scenes, it was kind of the same process of, Dori would work directly with level design often, what's the layout that you're going to enter into the scene, how it's going to happen. That all helps us early on because we know, okay, we're coming from X gameplay camera, we're going to blend into the cinematic. So we'd set up sort of this kind of interstitial camera to handle that blend. Renee Nunez, our other camera designer, did a lot of those and handled them quite well. And then kind of the vice versa, coming out of the scene, making sure that the characters are lined up, where they need to be, that, these invisible joints are where they need to be so the blend is smooth. And that we're also blending back into something that communicates to the player that they do have control. I think there's little tangents. There's times where we kind of like let the camera just settle, but there's other times where they need to know they have control back. So often we come out of cinematic into combat, you'll kind of feel the camera pull back a little bit in a very traditional communicative way of like, oh, something's going to begin. But yeah, I mean, aside from crazy things like jumping on flying dragons and other stuff, those are all very like...
Or off a huge hammer.
Off of a hammer, yeah. But I mean, the principle, a lot of those things can be the same. So even though within the scene, they're doing all this crazy stuff, if you enter into it with an interact and you come out of it with, kind of a standard position, a lot of that's kind of... pretty simple for us on our end, and Phil's got no issues.
It's very strange for me because I don't tend to deal too much in like the day-to-day of like setting these individual scenes up or evaluating this particular area or whatever. For me, the whole process starts with so what tools we're going to need for this project? What sort of area? What are we going to push forwards on this one? And I'll make little advances of they're going to come up with some plans or whatever, and I'll give them some things to solve maybe some broad problems that are obviously going to come up. I mean, it's kind of hard to speak to specifics on that one because where my head is right now, because I can't tell you what we're working on right now, obviously. But generally, we have this broad suite of problems, and I start solving them, and as they need them, I try and prioritize individual tools that get for that one. So I'm very reliant on Erol asking for a thing to solve a problem that he is aware of now. And in many ways, many times that's just like a reprioritizing, like a thing that I already knew we were going to work on. And so for me, it's a lot of like getting things done in the right and most efficient manner. And then at the end of it, I get to see, okay, so we did this thing. And for some reason, this is all perfect apart from this. It does this thing here and we don't understand why. And now I have to go in with a whole bunch of tools that I've written for myself to understand and analyze and see what's going on and why this thing isn't working, and then trace down whose fault it is, and then go and berate some poor junior programmer who has missed out the fact that this thing that they thought they could.
He just puts the dunce hat on them. Yeah,
I try not to these days. Yeah.
Dinner's ready.
It's the microwave.
I think, again, we kind of look back on the project and think about our fears and doubts, but I'd love to ask each of you if you can think in the moment, like, what is, for each of you, one of the most memorable problems that you overcame in kind of the development of this no-cut camera? It could even just be a reaction to a fear that you had in the moment you overcame that, like maybe something you're most proud of, maybe for each of you and within your departments.
Well, I'll go, I guess, while Phil's thinking. I mean, there were a lot. I guess one that sticks out to me was some of the Dragon Arena transitions, because those were aspects that I had sort of taken for granted, thinking, oh, we solved it this way earlier with these scenes, we can utilize this. And it turned out that we couldn't. So that involved, combat designer Mark and some Phil and Tom in programming, like come together really quick in a short amount of time to, find a solution for that worked. Because that was one in particular where like when that initial solution that I thought was going to work didn't work, was probably like my biggest points of fear in the project was like, oh crap, how are we going to do this, running out of time. But everyone came together and we found the solution. Some of it by just kind of talking to the right people. I think there was a change that was made for that scene we were talking about earlier, that first human kill scene. Mm-hmm. And when I got wind of that helped solve this particular problem. And that was just wonderful. Seeing everyone come together really meant a lot. So
yeah, I mean, for me, it's kind of like, it's an annoying answer, but it's just the fact that we managed to tell a story without cutting the camera. We really didn't know if we could do it. I mean, anybody can shoot a no-cut camera. You pull out your smartphone and you point your camera and you walk around all day. You're going to create a no-cut camera. But can you create an evocative story that gives viewers that today are very knowledgeable about being told a visual story and are very critical about it, a story that they can engage in and get emotionally evoked by without using tools that they're traditionally used to. So we didn't know if that would be successful until, the game shipped and we got like our first month's reviews. So that was on our end probably the biggest challenge.
I think the defining section of the game for me is the intro, because it's the bit that we probably put so much effort into that. There's so many like one-off mechanics in there that you barely use later on, or was not really shown, but more importantly, it was just the emotional resonance it had with me while I was working on it because I solved so many. Because the very intro with Kratos and the axe, that's a very particular form of camera, and it had a few issues, and so that would be like the go-to one for fixing like these types of sequences for me, because it was like really early on and very simple, and also I absolutely love the fact that having come off of these other games where we have this enormous explosive intro, enormous monsters, the biggest thing you've ever seen. And for Kratos in this game, his first boss is a tree, and he chops down the tree.
He got very angry at it, come on.
But it's that whole sequence. I mean, he then carries the log on his shoulder, which was difficult. He was being guided along a spline, so that's a very careful piece of tech. The enormous tree right next to the camera, basically any error in its motion was amplified because it's so huge. So we had to get that thing attached to him just working correctly. All of the transitions in that sequence were all like custom and unique and special, and all of them could fail in horrible ways. It has the first piece of really difficult collision as well, so because the camera's off on his right-hand shoulder and he gets really close to this tree on the right-hand side and playing the collision to make that all work. That was really intense for me. And then it comes into that bit where he's lighting the pyre. And for me, I lost a lot of family members over the last few years. And that was emotionally difficult. So right up until they get through that whole sequence, and then they rush off, and then you are actually under player control again. That whole bit for me was such a journey. Just getting that and making that look as good as it did and as clean and as seamless as it did, and still carrying through all the emotional impact put in there by everyone else in the studio. I was just, that's that for me. Getting that bit right, coming out of that and then into, and now here's our game. It's just, that's just, that was what I lived for. That was awesome.
And it did take all of us together to get this together. I mean, towards the end of the game, I remember thinking about how everybody was just firing off all cylinders and how everything just came together to make it work. I think that's really what made it happen.
Wow. Yeah, I never knew any of that. And Phil, that's emotionally kind of heart-wrenching and uplifting at the same time to hear you express it like that.
It was difficult, and I couldn't tell anyone. It was like because it's like the intro to our game. You can't talk about this. My wife talked about none of it. Yeah, it was very emotionally intense period. So,
yeah,
but it was awesome. The only thing that came close was the reveal when Kratos steps through, like out of the dark, and the entire auditorium just loses its shit.
Oh,
I know you guys you're talking about the reaction videos, but being in the middle of that when it happened, whoa! I'm never going to experience that again. Whoa!
We'll see about that.
I am hungry. Feed us.
Right. Wow, guys. Well, that was a hell of a way to kind of get us to the end of this journey. I do want to take a moment to ask each of you a question that I'm enjoying asking everybody that's partaking in this series, which is, for each of you, if you could rewind the clock and go back in time, just reflecting, maybe just a short thing. What is one thing that you wish we had more time to improve on with respect to the no-cut camera? If there's one thing that you wish we could have done or improved on.
I have one. Do you?
Go for it.
Collision. Collision. We started Collision too late. I underestimated the amount of work that player-controlled camera collision with the environment would take. And we made a few bad decisions, and I spent a significant chunk of the back end of the project fixing them all by hand. And not all of them. There's still things in there that I go, no, missed it. Whiffed that one.
But you spent a lot of time on the one that probably mattered most, which was the first 15 minutes of the game.
Yeah. I mean, it's just picking your battles.
Yeah.
Right? You only have so much time to make these things. So, it's like the most complex part out of it is the production level. You're trying to organize all of these millions of bits that go into like getting everyone together to make everything. Yeah.
Well, and not to sidebar here, but we all take that intro for granted. I mean, to the player, it looks like it's a somber, easy, relaxing scene to some degree. It's a serene nature walk with a log on his back, and nobody has any clue that, like you said, the millions of bits that go into making that possible, and kind of the emotional journey that we all go through creating it from every aspect of developing this game. So, Yeah, some of the things you shared, I think a lot of people on team aren't aware of because there's a lot of people that work on the game, and we're all not aware of what we're all working on all the time. So
It's a rational, isn't it? Is that everyone has like their different take on the thing. Like some people see it from this angle, and this has got this story, and someone else sees it from this angle and have this story. People take away different things.
Yeah, you always bring yourself to a story.
I don't think anyone has like a complete holistic view of everything that happened on this project, because there's a lot of things that connect to this project, and there's a lot of people that worked on it. It's like hundreds and hundreds of people just in the studio, and then in more. And you start bringing in everything outside. Even if you're just talking about the people who are focusing on it all the time, every day, that's hundreds of people still.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
you don't know
over the course of 5 years, absolutely. Yeah. What about for you, Erol?
Because there's something that I wish we knew then that we know now is that, where the player is the most important thing when it comes to showing things off, whether it's, vistas or going into some, narrative sequence. Coming out of the older games, they were sort of like a camera pass, quote unquote, that like a level would get done, camera would do its thing, the other one, they're all very discreet. Now, we realize that like a lot of this stuff needs to be discussed early. So talking with the level designers so that they can ensure that the player gets where it needs to be so that you can have that cool reveal of some awesome statue, some awesome monolith, that kind of thing, which we tried to retrofit after the fact. It doesn't go as well as planning it from the get-go, which is something we know now. But that's something that I feel, there's lots of awesome spaces in the game. In the exploration areas, there's so many cool statues that are just, scream God of War. That, going forward, we want to make sure that the lead up into that can facilitate both, level, art, and camera so it can, deliver it in the experience that we want to deliver it in.
Yeah, everything in God of War, obviously, it's the theme of larger than life, right? Mm. I don't think anybody knew that the stonemason was going to come alive at the end of the game there, and the way you guys make it feel like the Empire State Building is hovering over you with the camera. That's one of the things I've always loved about God of War games is, you kind of pull that trick, like something is always larger than you expect it to be.
Yeah.
You never know what's around the corner.
Right. And I think it's learning how to deliver that from not the old-fashioned way, which is just pull the camera back and it flies back and you see it. You can still get that sense of feeling from a camera that is close. One of the moments in one of the final scenes where Kratos and Atreus are together and the snake comes in and bites the stonemason. Like, you couldn't be closer to Kratos and Atreus and still feel that sense of scale. And we didn't have to pull the camera back, to show that. So I think being able to bring that aspect through, other parts into the future, I think will go a long way. But that was something that took a long time, I think, to learn.
Totally, yeah. To piggyback off that, there's a lot of things that I wish we knew then that we know now, but I think it's not a matter of could have been done better. It's just we needed to kind of sweat and bleed through that experience, like how to make something look giant when you can't pull back, or like how to transition to something, or how to tell an emotional beat without cutting. But one of the things that I think would have been helpful for us as a team, I think we're there now and would have been great to know earlier on, was the impact of a no-cut camera and how it creates cross-departmental reliability on each other. With the kind of older God of Wars, teams could be a little bit more self-contained because work was more bastioned. But when you don't cut, everything flows and impacts everybody else. And it took us a while to find out exactly where part of the work begins, where it ends, where there's a transition, what needs to be communicated. And we found it, but it would have sped us up a lot, and I think solved some growing pains if we knew earlier.
Well, that's a theme that we've been ringing through the halls of the studio, which is we are better together.
Absolutely.
We say it's all of our individual stories, but it's our journey together, our journey, your story. I sound like a marketing slogan for the studio now, but hey, it's part of what I do. Well, this was amazing, guys. I think everybody listening learned at least a few new things that they never knew about the development of the no-cut camera. And once again, guys, thank you so much for joining on this. Are there any final words you'd like to say to fans and developers and really anybody out there for each of you?
Thank you for playing, and we read all of your comments on all of the forums.
We do, and we shouldn't, but we do.
Oh, Phil, come on.
But we appreciate them.
I've read some things. It's not my fault. I want to throw Corey and Jason under the bus. It's their fault, totally.
They don't mind.
No, we like it.
Yeah, we can't be more thankful for the fans. Their engagement is so inspiring, and it makes what we do worth it. So super thankful.
Awesome, guys. Well, enjoy getting back to work on whatever it is we're working on next. Shh. And we'll end it with that. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
If you're interested in working here at Santa Monica Studio, we are actively hiring for our next project. You can learn about our studio and more about all of our open roles on our official site at sms.playstation.com. And if you're one of the many fans out there that wants to engage with us, you can follow us on Twitter at Sony Santa Monica or on Facebook, LinkedIn, or Instagram at Santa Monica Studio. If you enjoyed this episode of Worlds Collide, please hit that subscribe button wherever you might be listening to this podcast. From everybody here at Santa Monica Studio, thanks for listening.
Hey folks, this is Sid Schumann from PlayStation Blogcast. We hope you enjoyed this special episode of the show, which gave an inside look at Santa Monica Studio, creators of God of War. We'll see you next week with a normal edition of PlayStation Blogcast.